Spirit Radio Podcasts.
Back in April, the United States launched an attack using 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles on a Syrian government airbase in response to an alleged sarin nerve gas attack 2 days previously. The Pentagon called the airstrikes a proportional response to Assad's heinous act, indicating they had little doubt that the chemical attack was the work of the Syrian government, led by Bashar al-Assad. The swift response was widely applauded by Western governments and the media, though some questioned the legality of the missile strike and also whether one could be so sure of all the facts coming out of a war zone where few, if any, independent observers were able to move about freely. Now, our next guest has been looking into what is known about the chemical attack, which took place in an area called Khan Sheikhoun, and has taken time to read the report by fact-finding mission of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. On the line to tell us more, we have Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Peter, you're very welcome back to the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thanks for joining us. First of all, can you just remind us of the chemical attack and what actions were taken by the US in response to it, or what is supposed to have happened?
It's extremely difficult because what we had were, in some cases, videos uploaded onto YouTube, reports which came to us not through any independent Western media organizations, but at second-hand. Various very harrowing films showing people suffering poison gas attacks. And immediately an extraordinary rush to judgment by media and politicians who, although they were not in a position to check directly what had happened, although they had had nobody there. There were no Western staff journalists of major media organizations present. There were no Western diplomats present. In fact, there were no independent observers present. And it was concluded that what had happened was a sarin poison gas attack on people in the town of Khan Sheikhoun, which is in an area held by the people who are politely described as rebels in Syria. This is the al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate, which the Western powers are mysteriously backing in preference to the Syrian government. Mysteriously, in that you would have thought that an organization affiliated to al-Qaeda and with that kind of politics would be repugnant to Western powers, but there it is. So we have this as a starting point. We don't actually know what happened. We have an account of it, which many people, quite reasonably, because if for many people seeing is believing, and if the preponderance of the media take a particular line on something, people will tend to support it. But it seemed to me at the time, and I'm something of a student of Syria, and not just a student of Syria, but a long-time critic of the Syrian government, who can point to many years of extremely critical articles on the Syrian government for its brutality and unpleasantness. So I'm not an advocate of it or a defender of it, but so I'm very puzzled by the behavior of Western nations in the area and baffled completely by the idea that the Syrian government, which is actually turning a corner in its battle against the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda affiliate, should resort to a poison gas attack, which was the one thing that they could do which would absolutely guarantee a powerful Western military intervention on the side of their enemies.
Yeah.
And a powerful Western military intervention on the side of their enemies would be the one thing which might turn the war against them. So it was completely illogical that they should have done this thing, and I still haven't seen a persuasive explanation. So I was filled with doubt as to whether the reports we were seeing were true. The thing was then made worse by claims which seemed to me to be insupportable, made by the Russian Foreign Ministry about how the gas was actually in a warehouse belonging to the rebels and had been released by a bombing attack. Again, there didn't seem to be any material proof for that. So what amazed me was the absolute rush of the British, French, and United States governments to declare that the Assad government was responsible, which didn't seem to me to be based on any evidence. And then the actual cruise missile attack, which President Trump launched on a Syrian government airbase very shortly afterwards, seems to me to have been straightforwardly illegal under international law. There was no justification for it. The United Nations didn't authorize it. It wasn't in response to an attack on the United States. and there was no evidence for it, and yet it seemed to drive home in people's minds the idea that the Assad government was responsible for this action and was being punished for it.
But also,
then the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons sent a fact-finding team to try and find out what was going on. Of course, they were unable actually to get very far, because first of all they arrived a long time afterwards, and secondly, I need to go to the original report which I wrote here, and I do very much want people to look into this, because it is quite extraordinary in looking at this report, which is the only authoritative document we have on the whole matter, and how extraordinarily cautious it is. Anybody, if they go to Peter Hitchens' blog and look for the headline, "Who Gassed Whom in Syria?" they'll find a link to the OPCW's report. And one of the things that it says from the very beginning is how very, very limited its ability to find out what was going on was. So,
there you go.
I mean, I said at the time, any report which comes from this region is filtered through people who you never see in the film that does not get out. I've met men like them on my travels, and I wouldn't want to offend them. And I then went on to describe the al-Nusra people who might well be in charge of events.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's basically it. So we don't. The point is, we don't know. And on the basis of not knowing, it seems to me, especially after the catastrophe of the Iraq War in 2003, which has done so much lasting and continuing damage, and which is, in my view, for instance, directly responsible for the current chaos in Syria, and indeed for the current chaos in Iraq, and for the horrendous events which have been going on in Mosul, which, although the people who we dislike have been defeated, have been an enormous cost to the civilian population of Mosul, a cost which I don't think will ever be measured. All this avoidable, and because we rushed to judgment and we rushed into military action on the basis of what later turned out to be things we should never have believed.
Right. I mean, one of the things that struck me at the time was that Donald Trump was praised so unanimously, it seemed, by so many world leaders and so on, and he seemed to sort of get plaudits for launching, as you've pointed out, what seems to be an illegal missile attack. And I can't understand why the consensus is there that this is the most wonderful thing to do.
I'm afraid it's because people, by and large, will follow a crowd. Journalists, with some exceptions, are terribly sheep-like and will run about in flocks and like to say the same thing: the safety in numbers. Secondly, the safety in simplicity, the safety in credulity, and also there is, I think, in several major countries, and I name particularly France, the United States, and Britain, a strong government and establishment consensus in favor of overthrowing the Syrian government. And the reason for this is that all three countries are very, very closely entwined with the Saudi Arabian state, and which I regard as a pretty severe despotism. They're entwined with it for long-standing military, diplomatic, and political reasons, and also, I think, because they now owe Saudi Arabia a lot of money, and are in many cases seeking from it large contracts for weapons. And I think this influence on the establishments of countries does have an influence on the coverage of these things. And I think fundamentally what's going on in Syria, and most of the problems in the region, which have now spilled over into Ukraine, by the way, have their origins in Saudi Arabia's increasingly alarming confrontation with Iran, in which the Western powers are being pressed by Saudi Arabia to take the side of Saudi Arabia against Iran. And that's what the Syrian thing is really about, because Syria, as you will doubtless know, is a principal ally of Iran, and its ruling elite belongs to the Alawite sect, which is a subsection of Shia Islam, which is, of course, the kind of Islam followed in Iran, and the sort of Islam much despised by the Saudi state, which is wholly dominated by a very, very sectarian version of Sunni Islam. I hope I make myself clear, but this is what's really going on, and that explains why there is so much of a consensus.
Yeah, but I mean, how long before this goes kind of wrong, though, Peter, in terms of the fact that, we like to think of the Western powers as being ultimately moral, and we have these ideas...
Do we? I don't think I've ever suffered from that delusion.
Well, we would like, perhaps, and we would like
maybe.
to think...
I just don't think... I mean, there is a basic myth which we tell ourselves of how wonderful we are. It's founded on the Second World War. And it can only be sustained if you don't know what happened in the Second World War, which was, of course, that we only succeeded in defeating Hitler, a horrible and murderous tyrant,
by joining
forming
with Stalin.
a military alliance with Stalin.
Right.
Another horrible and murderous tyrant, and by paying for his support, by handing over into his tender care most of Eastern and Central Europe, which was then placed under secret police terror for several decades. While we were spared this in Western Europe, and that was probably the worst episode of appeasement in modern history. Everyone goes on about Neville Chamberlain appeasing Hitler in 1938, but hardly anyone mentions Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt appeasing Stalin in 1945. But our idea that we're good and moral in foreign policy just doesn't really stand up to examination, and people should be wary of it. There are definitely differences between the way people behave, and let's not pretend that there are none. But the idea that Western states and open, law-governed democratic states invariably behave in a moral fashion just doesn't stand up to examination.
Right. I mean, what's the end game? I mean, obviously this is a very difficult question to see, but do you see Syria? I mean, Emmanuel Macron actually came out yesterday, according to Reuters, and said he broke with previous French government position by saying he saw no legitimate successor to Assad.
Well, this is true, and a few days before that he said that the French policy was no longer to overthrow Assad. The problem is that very shortly before the Khan Sheikhoun episode, the one with which we began this conversation, the United States had begun to talk in the same terms. And one of the possible explanations of what happens, and I have no evidence for this other than the circumstantial, is that the anti-Assad forces might possibly have been, let's put it at the lowest possible level, have been glad of a pretext for jolting the United States back into a policy of hostility towards the Assad regime. And one was provided with amazing speed.
There do seem to be a lot of people out there who want war. That's the thing that strikes me.
Well, there are, aren't there? Yes, and this is the only people who want war are people who've never experienced it or never expect to experience it. And I like to point out to such people that 40, 50 years ago, there were people living in what was then Yugoslavia in peace, harmony, and prosperity in pleasant towns and villages, cheek by jowl with neighbors with whom they got on, who not long afterwards were turned into corpses or refugees in very large numbers in one of the worst civil wars in modern history. And that if you think that the life that you lead is safe, and if you think that these things will never happen to you, you are deluding yourself. The West have, often with far more public support than the governments deserve, have launched over and over and over again hell on earth on other parts of the world, imagining this would never come home to visit them. And what frightens me enormously is that sooner or later it will. As I say, the Ukraine war is an overspill of the Syrian war. Russia, by opposing Saudi Arabia's ambitions in Syria, brought upon it the wrath of the United States, which then embarked on its very rash westward expansion of the European Union into Ukraine, which was any fool who knows any history knew was going to provoke a strong Russian reaction. And so large parts of Ukraine, which were previously at peace, which I'd visited a few years before, I'm thinking of a town called Gorlivka, or Kolivka if you prefer the Ukrainian pronunciation, are now death zones, to the total surprise of their inhabitants. And these are European towns and cities and European landscape. These are death zones because of the war in Syria.
Yeah.
So don't think it can't come to you.
Well, what you're saying,
it can.
What you're saying is that at some point Tomahawk missiles could be landing on an airbase near. I mean, you're sort of saying that.
Well, I don't know about that. The form which it takes is not known to me. Well, I do know at the beginning of the Syrian crisis, I was appalled because I started to get correspondence from a British woman whose provenance I checked, who I knew to be who she said she was, a perfectly normal British woman in many ways, coming from the semi-suburban home counties of England, reasonably prosperous middle-class person, who'd married a Syrian and was living in Latakia. And as the BBC began to report what it called the rebellion and the civil war, she sent me privately letters about what she was experiencing, and what she was experiencing was something completely different from that.
Right.
Which was the gradual destruction of civil society and the increasing arrival of people who were obviously, who by the Arabic they spoke and their appearance and everything else, were obviously highly trained militants being brought in, and well on highly trained militants being brought in from outside to destabilize what had, for all Syria's many faults, which, as I say, I've been one of the few people to write about in the British popular press. For all Syria's faults, it was a stable country in which there was a great deal of religious tolerance, and in which people could live, for the most part, prosperous and reasonably settled lives, provided, of course, they didn't challenge the government. And that all ended. And her life, her happy life in Latakia came to an end. She's had to flee the country now. She was fortunate she was able to do so more easily than most, but lots of her neighbors had nowhere to go and are now condemned perhaps to decay the rest of their lives, bringing up children in refugee camps, heaven help us.
Yeah. Just before I let you go, predictions as to what you think might happen in that part of the world?
I daren't. Every time I've felt optimistic that the Western powers have finally decided that they're not going to get rid of Assad, something happens which turns it around again. There is a very grim determination here. And Saudi Arabia, Jimmy, people go on and on about all kinds of regimes and how terrible they are, and I've no doubt that the things that they say are true, but we're so selective about this. People know that Assad has torture chambers and prisons and people who and is repressive and destroys his opponents, but Saudi Arabia, for goodness sake, is one of the worst despotisms on the face of the planet. And its close neighbor Bahrain is pretty bad as well, but these are our allies, so we don't say anything about it. And I don't know how long we can carry on indulging this, or indeed I also don't know how long Saudi Arabia can continue to be ruled as it is being ruled, because it's undergoing a major internal revolution at the moment, which could greatly destabilize it. So I daren't predict. I'm very worried. I find the whole thing extremely frightening.
Well, we will have to leave it there, but Peter Hitchens, thank you for your time this morning.
Well, thank you for yours. Thanks a lot. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to our Spirit Radio podcast. Don't miss out. Subscribe today. Find out how at spiritradio.ie.